Hello, my name is Yorkie and welcome to episode 5 of the In-Depth Track Guide series, a series for Assetto Corsa Competizione where I give you all the juicy knowledge, information and tips that you need in order to properly learn a circuit and improve on your lap times. So if the series is of interest to you and you are new here, then please consider subscribing to the channel with the bell notification so you won't miss out on any future episodes. And if you want to support the channel further, you can find links to my social media pages down in the description below, as well as a link to my Discord server where it'll be awesome to have you come in and join the growing community. Now, if you haven't already guessed by the background footage that you're seeing here, this 5th episode is going to be covering Misano in Italy. Now, it's not exactly a circuit that features on many track rosters across various sim racing games, but it's actually quite a bit of fun to drive and offers a few challenging corners around the circuit. The track length overall is 2.62 miles, which equates to 4.22 kilometers and has a total of 16 turns. To get the most out of the track, you want to gear the car setup towards a high downforce hard suspension, as the track is fairly smooth with low curbs. And then the key action areas where you'll probably find the most overtaking is, as you can see, turn 1, 4, turn 8, turn 10, 13 and 14. Just like the previous episodes, we'll start with the pit entry and pit exit, and with the pit entry, where pretty much as soon as you dive into the pit lane, you're going to be needing to start slowing the car down in order to get through the left-handed bend that is here between the two Armco barriers on the inside of the final turn, and then you can give a short spurt on the throttle before reducing the speed down and engaging the pit speed limiter before you get to the line, which is basically at the end of the Armco barrier that you see on the right hand side of the screen here, and just after the building on the left of the pit lane. For the pit exit, we're actually going to trundle down between the Armco barriers after leaving the pit garage area, still on the limiter, until we get to around about the outside of turn 1, where you will pass a traffic light, and then very shortly after you come to the disengage the pit limiter line, as you can see here. You can then accelerate away out of the pit lane itself, staying to the left hand side of the white line and then rejoining the circuit on the outside of turn 3. For the very first corner and our braking zone, we're going to try and get the car as far left as possible and actually straddle the curb on the left hand side of the circuit here. This is roughly our braking point, about 75 meters or so before the corner. We'll be getting hard on the brakes and shifting down into second gear before turning in and aiming to hook up our apex here on the inside. Now, in both the dry and wet conditions, you can use this inside curb and actually take a fair amount off on the inside as well. There are 2 sleeping policemen here on the inside. However, in most cars you should be able to hammer and take these without too much of an issue. As we come out the exit of turn 1, we immediately come in towards turn 2, and there's just going to be a very short braking zone here just to bleed off a little bit more speed before we turn into the apex. We're going to maintain that second gear as we come through the corner, once again taking a fair amount off on the inside in the dry conditions, hammering those sleeping policemen, but in the wet conditions you want to be a little bit more cautious and a little bit more wary, as we're going to be picking up the throttle a little bit more aggressively coming off the exit of the turn here. As we come off the exit of turn 2, you don't want to let the car drift out too wide. Instead, you want to be lurking in and around the middle of the circuit, roughly around about here, as turn 3 immediately follows, and we need to try and open up this corner as much as possible. You should be pretty much flat out all the way through the corner, just hooking up the apex in and around here, where you can actually shave a fair amount off on the inside of the turn as well. The curb is serrated, it's quite smooth, it's quite flat. However, in the wet conditions, you'll probably be wanting to avoid this curb almost entirely, as it will cost us the traction coming off the corner and likely result your car pivoting into a spin. For the exit curb, you will also be wanting to avoid it in the wet conditions. However, you can make free use of this area in the dry, as it's a serrated curb and beyond that painted tarmac, so you can wander out here. However, you do need to keep 2 wheels within the confines of the circuit to avoid picking up a track limits penalty. For turn 4 we have a pretty slow speed right-hander, and this is our braking zone here just before we get to the 50 meter board, about 70 to 75 meters before the corner, and we're actually going to use the reference of the end of the painted tarmac there as the start of our braking zone, where we're going to drop down into first gear and then turn into our apex. We've got a bit of camber here that we can use to our advantage, and just like the first 3 turns, we can take a fair amount off on the inside in the dry conditions. You can also do this in the wet conditions as well, considering the corner is such slow speed. On the exit of turn 4 we have a serrated curb with more painted tarmac just beyond it. You can use this out in the dry, however do be wary that turn 5 pretty much immediately follows, and obviously you want to avoid running out this wide to the curb out here in the wet conditions, as that will hurt our traction. For the apex of the 5th corner, you're going to be hooking up the inside curb just round about here. Again, another sawtooth curb with some flat painted tarmac just on the inside. You can use this in the dry conditions, however be very cautious in the wet conditions and possibly avoid it entirely. But either way, you want to try and hang tight to the exit, as pretty much as soon as we come out of turn 5 we're into the apex of turn 6, where you'll be needing to carry a bit more speed through the corner for the long back straight. You can use the curb here on the inside in the dry conditions, however avoid it in the wet conditions. You do have the additional serrated curbing there on the inside as well. And then when it comes to the exit, we've got a serrated curb with more additional serrated curbing on the outside there, as well as a couple of sleeping policemen. As you probably expect, you can use this to your heart's content in the dry conditions and run out quite nice and wide, providing that you're staying with 2 wheels on the first level of serrated curbing. However, in the wet conditions, running out onto the slippery curb will cost you the traction, potentially put you into a spin, and obviously hurt your run onto the back straight. Turn 7 is the slight left-handed kink that's in the straight, so the next braking zone that we're going to be coming into is going to be for turn 8 here, and this is our braking point at the 100 meter board. We're going to be shifting down into first gear and turning the car in, aiming to hook up the apex just here on the inside curb, where once again in both the dry and wet conditions you can take off a little bit on the inside. There is quite a fair amount of camber in this corner, so we want to try and pick up the throttle as soon as we possibly can, use that to our advantage and let the car run out towards the exit curb, where again in the wet conditions we'll be wanting to avoid this to not hurt the traction coming off the corner, but in the dry conditions you can run out wide here and kind of straddle the car over this serrated curb that is here. It's quite low profile as the rest of the curbs are around the track, and obviously it will allow us to get earlier onto the throttle to get the best drive possible up the slight hill up towards turns 9 and 10. Turn 9 is this little right-handed kink that you see here, and the start of the curbing there is going to be the start of our braking zone for the more important turn 10, the right-handed hairpin that immediately follows. We're going to be braking in and around the middle of the circuit and shifting down into first gear before turning in towards our apex. Now you want to be trying to get as close to the inside curb as you possibly can, but you don't necessarily need to touch it in order to get the most out the corner. Instead, what you want to do is try and get the car as nice and straight as possible for the exit, and bringing in the throttle in hard and early to get ourselves a good drive onto the straight that follows. Of course though, turn 10 has an exit curb which is serrated with some flat painted tarmac beyond that. However, this time round there is a bit of gravel just out here, so you don't want to be running out too wide, not only because of the gravel but also because of the track limits. You want to try and keep 2 wheels within those white lines to avoid any potential penalty, and of course in the wet conditions you want to avoid touching the curb pretty much entirely. Coming down along the straight, you'll come through 2 flat out right-handed kinks, turns 11 and 12. This is 11 here, and in the dry conditions you can run this curb no problem, although do avoid it in the wet. There is quite a fair amount of camber in this corner, so you've got that to work with as well in those kind of conditions. And then turn 12 follows very quickly after, and once again you can use this inside curb in the dry conditions, although please do avoid it in the wet conditions. There is also some camber here as well to work to your advantage, but pretty much as soon as we come out the apex of this corner we then come into the braking zone for turn 13. The beginning of our braking zone and our reference point is going to be the end of the apex curbing for turn 12, where we're going to be getting hard on the brake, shifting down into third gear, lurking in the middle of the circuit before turning the car into the apex of turn 14 itself, where in the dry conditions we're going to be aiming to hook up the inside curb. However, we want to try and stay clear of it or avoid it in those wetter conditions. We want to try and carry as much speed as possible through the corner, so coming out through the exit we're going to run out a little bit wide, try and keep two wheels on the serrated curve that's on the exit here. Use it in the dry conditions, again avoid it in those wetter conditions, but we then very quickly come into the braking zone for turn 14. The reference for our braking point is at the 50-meter mark, and although the board itself is on the right hand side of the circuit, you do have the white strip that's there on the left hand side, and we're going to use that as our reference point. So we're going to be braking hard, shifting down into first gear and turning the car into the right-handed hairpin and hooking up the inside curb, where we're going to be aiming to apex the corner fairly late to try and get a good run coming off the exit. The inside curb itself is serrated with some flat painted tarmac on the inside, so use this to your advantage in both the dry and also the wet conditions. Then coming out through the exit, obviously avoid the exit curb in the wet. However, in the dry you're free to run out here, although obviously try and keep two wheels within the confines of the circuit as well. You don't necessarily need to run out that far wide anyway, because we need to bring the car back over to the right hand side to open up the penultimate turn. Coming into turn 15, this is going to be our apex point here. There's no need to brake coming into this corner, but as we're coming through the apex, we are going to lift off the throttle just for a short, brief moment. We can use the inside curb and hammer those sleeping policemen on the inside there in the dry conditions, pretty much no problem. Although in the wet, you're going to want to avoid this curb entirely. And then again, on the exit, avoid the curb entirely in the wet conditions. However, in the dry, you can run out nice and wide out here, providing that you keep the two left-hand wheels of the car on the serrated curbing that is here to avoid picking up a track limits penalty. Obviously you want to try and carry as much speed as possible through the corner, but we then come into the final turn itself, turn 16. This is going to be our braking point just as we are getting to the start of the curbing on the right hand side of the circuit, about 55 to 60 meters before the corner. We're going to drop the car down into second or third gear depending on your personal preference, and in the wet conditions you want to avoid this curve pretty much entirely. However, in the dry, what you're going to be aiming to do is ride over as much of the two-tiered serrated curbing that is there on the inside, while still maintaining some of your right wheels over that white line to keep yourself within track limits. You want to try and carry as much possible speed through the corner, and then as you come out through the exit, drift the car out nice and wide. Make use of the curbing on the exit there in the dry conditions. Avoid it completely in the wet, but you can venture pretty far out wide, providing that you keep the two left-handed wheels on that first set of serrated curbing that is there. Obviously that's then going to give you the best speed and momentum through the corner and off onto the start-finish straight to complete the lap. So now that we've gone through each and every individual corner and broken it all down, let's take a look at piecing it all together at full racing speed. So with a solid lap there completed, bar a slight mistake in the final corner where I missed the apex slightly, I just want to finish the episode by saying that all the brake markers and apexes that you have seen here and the amount of curb use that you can use is going to depend on the car and conditions that you are obviously driving in. As I mentioned, you got the dry versus the wet conditions, and some curbs you can take in the wet, however other curbs you need to avoid or be cautious with. But obviously depending on the setup and also the actual car that you're driving, some cars handle curbs a little bit better, some are able to brake a little bit harder and later than other cars as well. So please keep that in mind as you're lapping around the circuit and taking everything on board here. If you enjoyed the episode though, please give the video a thumbs up. If you're new here, please consider subscribing to the channel as well. And as I mentioned, social media links and links to my Discord server are down in the description below. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you again in the next one. But until then, have fun, stay safe, and take care.